Most of us today hear Bach's music in recordings or in concert halls. In his own time, Bach's music was more intimately involved in the daily lives of people. Germany was predominantly Lutheran, and Bach, as a choir director in large churches, was responsible for providing as well as conducting music for the church services. Often, melodies for church use, known as chorales, were taken from Gregorian chants, folk tunes, and hymns composed or compiled by Martin Luther. Bach wrote four-part harmony for these melodies and expanded some into larger works. Some of these four-part harmonizations are still used by churches at various denominations. But during his life, Bach was chiefly concerned with the making and doing of the music of his time. His various court and church positions demanded a tremendous output. Fortunately, he was a man of intense energy and, in addition, excellently trained. As a young man, he had analyzed and rearranged all the works of famous composers which he could find, and had studied with the prominent musicians of the cities where he worked from the time he was 15. Because he was so solidly grounded in fundamentals, he was able to maintain his flow of compositions and arrangements with remarkably consistent high quality.
This film is about the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, interpreted in many different ways through music and dance. Bach remains with us today, not just through live concert performances, but also through the many recordings of his works. More records of his music are sold today than ever before. Desmond Dupre plays Bach's third suite for lute on a traditional instrument of the 18th century.
In Bach's time, musicians usually performed contemporary works, written or arranged for the specific occasion at which they were played. There were few great collections of music of the past, and often, to meet the practical necessities of performance, Bach rearranged compositions for the kinds of instruments or choral ensembles available. He also transcribed compositions as a teaching tool for his many students. Many of the manuscripts were lost. So undoubtedly were some of the few copies of those that were printed during Bach's life. This was not the result of carelessness, but of the fact that there was no sense of urgency about saving manuscripts for posterity. Musicians were expected to compose and perform as needed. For Bach, producing a continuous supply of compositions was part of the work which helped him to support his large family. It was more than that, because Bach was not only dedicated to music, but to the spiritual values he communicated and expressed through his religious compositions. The world regrets the missing manuscripts, but the body of work that survived is not only large, but of a musical brilliance that repays repeated listening.
Many people think of Bach as the greatest musical creator of all time. More than 200 years after his death, his music has a universal appeal to all generations, and it can be played in any style. Bach's music was often written in the form of dances, which were popular in his time: bourrées, sarabands, and gavottes. In the 18th century, such music was intended for princely entertainment. It was a pleasant pastime, a relaxation at court. The harpsichord pieces of Johann Sebastian Bach ushered in a new world of music. These days, there are other sorts of keyboard instruments on which Bach's music can be played. With the help of advanced techniques, a solo performer can reproduce the entire range of an orchestra. He can go further and bring to Bach's music a completely new interpretation based on the infinite range of electronic possibilities of the synthesizer. Bach was a musical household name even before the birth of Johann Sebastian. He soon joined the family tradition, first as a fiddler and then as an organist. His musical output was fantastic and stretches to over 50 volumes, mostly religious in style. It was a job, and like a clerk, it was his function to turn out regular weekly work. Musicians of that time were not free, as in later years. They were simply employees who wore the livery of their masters like other servants. Life ran its course within very narrow confines. Only a Bach, with his genius, could overcome all these limitations to achieve musical immortality. The English Chamber Orchestra plays Bach's Second Flute Suite. The flute is played by Richard Aidney. Such classical suites were composed of a series of traditional dances. The orchestra continues with a saraband, a slow, graceful dance of Spanish origin. It is performed by members of the London School of Contemporary Dance.
In his time, Bach was known primarily as an organist and choral director. The reason is simple. In these functions, he filled a role which townspeople could see and appreciate. We today, though we know his other music well, still appreciate his magnificent organ works. Bach's compositions are remarkable for many reasons, among them their adaptability. His music adapts to any instrument, including the harmonica, which was not invented until long after Bach's death and was considered a child's toy. But a young American, Larry Adler, not too many years ago, developed the harmonica into a concert instrument on which he now plays a Bach composition.
The Fantasia in C minor, played by George Malcolm.
You and I take Bach for granted in the sense of accepting his music as one of the world's permanent monuments to genius. But when Bach died in Leipzig, Germany, the city did not go into mourning. He had been known there primarily as an organist. In the larger world of music, he was still thought of as the old-fashioned composer of primarily church music. He had left his wife and children very poor, and they were allowed to live and die in poverty. For over 50 years, Bach was forgotten. Some of his minor works were played occasionally by young students, but there was no interest in performing his great cantatas and orchestral works. Actually, most had not been printed, and many of the manuscripts were lost. Then, by accident, a 20-year-old music student came upon some old Bach manuscripts. He was Felix Mendelssohn, and when he read the music, he was immediately aware that he had discovered greatness. He became obsessed with the need to bring this music to the world. He was particularly impressed with Bach's St. Matthew's Passion, and with a friend, he maneuvered and labored to arrange a performance. The performance was a resounding success and was the beginning of a Bach revival throughout Europe and the world. A few years later, Mendelssohn conducted another performance of the St. Matthew in Leipzig to help the city pay for a monument to Bach. It was a splendid gesture, but the chief monument to Bach will always be his music, in which he still lives.